we are starting now. So the patron and chancellor of the university is on his way, together with the registrar of the university and some colleagues. Okay, we may be seated. I'm pleasantly surprised, Patron, to see this number of people in this rain. So welcome, everybody, and welcome to the Patron and Chancellor of the University of South Africa. And we have the Registrar of the University, Professor Temane, here in front, Michael Temane, and two colleagues who are also teaching at TMALI, Professor Mazibugo in the extreme right, not politically or ideologically extreme right, and, and Dr. Paswane next to her. In the interest of time, I'm going to request Professor Temane, the registrar, to welcome on behalf of the university, the chancellor and the patron. The principal of the university apologizes, patron, as we indicated, is out of the country. Professor Temane, please.
Program Director, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our Chancellor and the patron of TMALI, His Excellency Dr. TM Mbeki. Chancellor, it's always a wonderful opportunity for us to interact with your kind self as you avail yourself, to the institution and to the various processes of the institution, but especially today, with this particular session. So we're grateful, to have you here, sir. And to my colleagues, from TMALI, please feel welcome, and I'm glad to see you and to welcome you here. As you heard, our Vice Chancellor is traveling out of the country, and he only returns tomorrow evening, so we've been asked to represent him in welcoming all of you. So all of you are warmly welcomed, especially under these conditions of the weather. Inclement weather is not easy for some people to deal with, and other people thrive on it, so I hope, yes, welcome.
Thank you so much, Prof. So the way we do this is that you'll ask questions or make comments directed to the patron and chancellor of the university, the former president. And we prioritize first-time students always. Luckily, we get to know those that have been with TMALI before. So if I ignore you, it's because I know that you've been at TMALI before, but I promise not to ignore anybody, actually. But in the interest of time, we're going to start. Okay, let's please have the hands so that I can recognize.
Good afternoon, His Excellency. My name is Chukuma Chizobanyekwe. I am from Nigeria. So my question to His Excellency is this. Because we learned from our study guides in TMALI about how to address the conflicts that is spreading all over the continent, some of the conflicts. So the question I want to pose to His Excellency is, based on the information I got from the TMALI book, that one of the sources that causes many conflicts in the continent is the arbitrary drawing of colonial boundaries. So my question is, why?
Try keep the mic slightly far from you. Yeah.
Okay. My question is, what steps are the African Union taking to encourage the mechanism of referendum, so that the people that are domiciled in many of all those places where there's conflicts such as we are experiencing now in southern Kenya and in Biafra land in Nigeria, and the experience in the Ivory Coast, so that they can use the process of referendum to express their desire or their wish in order to here address the colonial boundaries and stem the source of conflicts in the continent.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, His Excellency. That's my question.
Thank you. Let's take the next to you, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Mutula Sitwe, and I am from Bloemfontein. I'm an aspiring district economist. We attended the African International Trade class, and in our class we have two questions. The first being, can the current currency crisis in South Africa be attributed to South Africa joining BRICS? And then the second one, will the African continental free trade area address the removal of borders? And what does it mean by the free movement of people? Thank you.
Okay, I would have thought that you answered the first one in class, but I guess you're continuing tomorrow. Next, please. The first one, Patron, is whether the currency crisis in South Africa can be attributed to BRICS. I think that question should belong to class, but we'll see if the Patron wants to tackle it. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Ayan from Eastern Cape. Now, I emanate from the Good Governance class. Now, in view of the President being one of the champions of the instruments relating to NEPAD, the peer review mechanism, what is his feeling currently? Are they realizing the set out objectives in the present day that they were designated to achieve? That is our question.
Thanks, very clear. I think I know the answer. Please come to the front here, because she was number 3 actually, we passed it. Yeah, please come to her in front. Tsepo, give her the mic.
Good afternoon. My name is Ananda Keleneshi. I'm from the class Thought Leadership. My question to His Excellency is, what is his views on the proposed single currency for Africa in the new Africa Free Trade Deal, and how it will impact South Africa and regional integration, if at all?
Thanks. That's linked to the question, I suppose, around the free trade area in Africa. Yes, please.
Good afternoon to His Excellency. My name is Esther Kubujan. I'm from Victoria. My question to you is, in your views, do you see the African government ready to implement or achieve the Agenda 2063?
That's for the whole of the continent? You're talking about the whole of the continent, if the African continent is ready to implement the Agenda 2063? Okay, I think that might be your assignment question, actually. Just be careful, Patron. Please don't go into a lot of detail when you answer that one. I do think it's an assignment question. Okay, I think, wait, I think that's a long list now. We originally hoped for 5. Yeah, take it. Please go for it. We're already standing, but that will be the last round for now, please. Yeah.
Good afternoon, Your Excellency. My name is Eugene Gandhi, and I'm from Bumanang, Middleburg. And Your Excellency, I would like to know, with regards to the Constitution being amended.
Please take the mic a bit far from you and start afresh.
I would like to know,
yes,
with regards to the Constitution being amended, with regards to land expropriation without compensation, what are his views on it, and will it be able to benefit the poor of the poorest? Thank you.
Okay. Was that supposed to be a provocative question or what? I think the patron has answered this question many times. And my patron, over to you.
Very provocative, you're right, Bruce. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Vusi. Let me first of all join the registrar in saying welcome to all of you, and hope that you will have a fruitful time here at TMALI. And indeed, I'm sure, as people have said to you, basically we are very interested to create, to build these African thought leaders. Because indeed, our own feeling is that the continent needs those thought leaders a great deal. And so hopefully, the work that you'll be doing here will help us to achieve that important objective. It's to give the African continent the capacity it needs to be able to successfully address the challenges that it faces. So I really wish you well in your studies. I know the teaching staff that Professor Gumeder introduced are indeed very committed to make sure that we do what is necessary with regard to producing these quality people as you do these short courses. Now, as far as these questions are concerned, the first question was about these arbitrary colonial boundaries, and indeed, as you heard, the examples were given about Cameroon, about Nigeria, with regard to the Biafra thing, Cote d'Ivoire, with regard to the conflict that they had there. I think the first point, of course, is that you know the old resolution of the OAU, old resolution of the OAU taken quite early on, I think 1964, something like that, which was that the African countries committed themselves to respect the colonial boundaries. So we continue to insist on that. And the reason for it is because if you didn't, you might create a situation of conflict right around the continent. Exactly for the reason that the matter arose in terms of your dealing with matter about conflict resolution. Because indeed these were arbitrary, the colonial boundaries. You come from Nigeria, so I don't know how long we've been here. For instance, we had just talk about South Africa. Many years back, just before 1994, in fact, not just before 1994, the Kingdom of Swaziland said that Swaziland historically comes virtually up to Johannesburg. And therefore, they wanted all this territory to be ceded to Swaziland. So we, in the end, when we came into government, we discussed this matter with the government of Swaziland and so on, but you see the issue I'm raising. You would get this fragmentation on the continent and a big fight. That's why the original decision, which is being respected, about the need to maintain the colonial boundaries. There are two instances where this has not happened, with the result being accepted by the OAU and later the African Union. That's the case of Sudan, when, as you remember, the Southern Sudan seceded. The earlier one is the secession of Eritrea from Ethiopia. By agreement of the Ethiopians and the Eritreans. It was an internal agreement. And the same thing with the Sudanese. And I think there's only 2 instances where the colonial boundaries have been changed. As a result, perhaps, this reference you are making to referendum, but so that's an internal thing. For instance, in the Cameroon case, if we followed that example, I'm quite sure that the African Union would say, we await the decision of the people of Cameroon about this. If they decide to do whatever with their country, we'll respect it. So I'm saying that's certainly what's happened with regard to South Sudan and Eritrea. I am glad you said one of the causes of the conflict is this matter about these arbitrary colonial boundaries in terms of conflicts. Because I think if you look around, in terms of the conflicts that have happened on the continent, this would not be one of the matters. The Africans, even before the formation of the Organization of African Unity, the conscious Africans have always shared a sentiment towards African unity, towards African integration. You'd see this from the 19th century, people talking about this. In a sense, saying we are really one people who share a common destiny. And then, of course, came the colonial thing, and then they cut up these borders. But I'm saying the tendency was towards, from long time ago, let us unite as Africans. Even if you take the case of Sudan, they agreed in 2005 that South Sudan would have the right to conduct a referendum in 2011 to decide whether it wanted to secede or not. So that was the agreement between the government and the Sudan People's Liberation Movement. But in the context of what I'm saying, they also agreed that they would use that 6-year period between 2005 and 2011 to make unity attractive. So the intention was not to separate. Let's make unity attractive so that by the time you have the referendum in 2011, let the people vote for this attractive unity. So I'm saying that's generally, basically, would be the sentiment shared around the continent against any notion of the further fragmentation and balkanization within the continent. All the African countries are characterized by this diversity in terms of culture, in terms of language, and then so on. I don't think there's any African country that doesn't have that kind of diversity. Some more than others. So Nigeria, the fact that you have the Igbo people who live together with the Yorubas and the Hausa and the Fulani and so on, there's nothing in it which suggests that because you've got these different identities, therefore you must establish different territorial things called states. I mean, if you take this country, Here you've got, how many official languages do we have? 11. 11 official languages. Now you see, Venda and Shangaan and Xhosa and Zulu and Tswana and there's English now. Now, sure, these are identities. Language-wise, culture, I'm not so sure. But the fact that they are there in these identities should not necessarily lead to the conclusion, therefore, they need to secede from one another to form little mini-states. As Africans, the challenge we face is to how to unite in diversity. And that's a problem in Cameroon. That's a problem in Cameroon. It's not for, in my view, for a portion of Cameroon to secede and maybe link up with Nigeria, but that the Cameroonians should indeed, and President Paul Biya needs to lead a process so that the Cameroonians get together and say, what is it that we do in order to make sure that we live together as one people? You see the tensions that are accompanying the current elections in Sierra Leone. With Sierra Leone's People's Party in the south, which is strongest in the south of the country, competing with the All People's Congress. And unfortunately, that conflict, which is political, but underlying it is also ethnic identities. So again, you see, I think it would be wrong to say, in order to resolve that tension and so on, split the country into two. I think what we would want to say is, let's, as Sierra Leoneans, get together and say, what is it that divides us? And what is it that we need to do in order that we unite? And part of what has divided people on the continent, and Sierra Leone is an example, is, my party wins the elections. And I then, I'm President Gumede. But instead of seeing myself as a president of this country and all its people, I see myself in practice as president of the people who elected me. So you get a discrimination in terms of distribution of resources, access to power, and all of this. And that's what causes the tension. It's not so much a colonial boundary. It's a misgovernance that then causes this tension. That's what I'm saying, that, and then in the end, people will then say, because we're disadvantaged, because in Nigeria, you had then, as they were saying, the North very dominant in the politics of Nigeria. It's better that we form an independent Biafra. I'm saying you solve the problem by interacting. The same issue has been raised now in Kenya, where people say that you've got the Kikuyus and the Kalenjin, who are currently in government now, and so long as those two act together, then it means the Luos and the Luyas and all these others will forever be excluded from access to power. It's necessary for the Kenyans to engage that issue. I think not to concede the notion that because we have been discriminated in one way or the other, therefore, let us secede. So, you get the drift of what I'm saying. I think we, in terms of even addressing that matter of these colonial boundaries, I think we need to go beyond just here are the boundaries. to say what is it that caused tension in Nigeria such that you had Biafra, and address it as Nigeria. What is it that's caused the tension now in Cameroon, and address it. And I think you find that the matter of the colonial boundary sort of recedes. Now, there was a question about the African Free Trade Area. I think this has been in the perspective, in terms of what I was talking about earlier, about African unity, African integration. This has been part of the thinking for many, many decades, that indeed we need to have this African Free Trade Area. And practically what's happened over the years, as you know, is that what the continent then decided was that we would start with these regional economic communities, SADC and ECOWAS and so on. But always it's been, the view has always been that we build from those regional economic communities to this one African a continental community. So it's a good thing if indeed the negotiations can be concluded so that you have this free trade area, so that people and goods and so on can move on the continent more freely. It's a challenging job. I think all of us saw that from what the media were reporting, there were 44 countries that signed now in Kigali, which means there are 11 who didn't. I'm not sure which one those are, except Nigeria has been mentioned by name. But it means there are continuing negotiations that must take place so that indeed everybody comes into this free trade area. But it is a good thing. But it's not going to be easy in the end. The agreement will be reached, but as I think everybody knows, you'd also face the problem. You can talk about the tariffs and say, okay, let us remove the tariffs, let's reduce them, let's do whatever. Then there's another problem that arises, which is a problem of non-tariff barriers. So that though it's allowed free movement, I read of an instance in ECOWAS where they were saying that part of the problem is that because you've got free movement of goods and services because of this free trade area, but still the borders are there. And so you will drive a truck, you want to come to the next country, and then you'll find people there who say, I haven't had tea today, and so you must give something. And if you don't, it's going to hold you up. And I'm saying these non-tariff barriers. So it's going to be a big struggle to get this thing to work, but it is important that it works. That vision about this economic integration on the continent also has had this view that there should be a common currency. Now, this is a rather complicated matter of a common currency. I don't think the continent is in a position now to go for a common currency, not now. We need to create various conditions. If you look, for instance, at what's happening in Europe in terms of the euro, common currency, and issues are being raised there that one of the things that you need in terms of being able to have a successful common currency system is, for instance, really virtually an integration of the budgeting systems. so that your fiscal interventions in each of these countries in the monetary union, your fiscal interventions reinforce one another. Now, it is a very complicated thing. Where you need gold reserves, for instance, to back the paper money. You can't say tomorrow, let's have a common currency. Agreed. Then you say, what are you going to contribute in terms of something, a reserve to back this currency? And I mean, the South African, the rand, the South African rand, you would see that they always report about what kind of reserves they have in foreign currency, in gold, and all of that. That's how currencies work. So I'm saying that I don't think we're at this stage yet on the continent where we can have such a common currency. Too many other conditions need to be met. But there was a reference to a currency crisis. I wasn't quite sure. I asked the registrar. The registrar is much more educated than I am. So I said to him, Registrar, what is this currency crisis in this country? He didn't know. If he doesn't know, it means I don't know. So, unless it's explained, we'll see, we can come back to it. With regard to the APRM, the African Peer Review Mechanism, and NEPAD, I think the positive things that we should say about these two is that the continent has continued its commitment to both. So the structures and the systems remain. What's happened with the APRM over some time is that it sort of lost momentum. It lost momentum for some time, and then 2 or 3 years back, Kenya, President Kenyatta was elected to chair the Heads of Government Committee in charge of NEPAD. And indeed, we must say that he then did a lot to make sure that the APRM is reactivated. So it is now in much, much better shape than it was. And it is doing the work that it's doing. I can't remember exactly the number of countries that have now voluntarily joined the system, the mechanism. It's 36 or 37, thereabouts. So I think it's doing well. Part of the challenge with regard to the APRM, I think, is a follow-up by the continent in terms of what the review mechanism reports. For instance, just give you one example. When they did a review of Kenya some years back, that review said that if certain things were not done in Kenya, there was bound to be conflict, political conflict in Kenya. So we met as peers, we met with the then President Mwai Kibaki and discussed this and said, this thing must be attended to, otherwise problems. Well, in the end, that's why you then had the conflict in Kenya in 2007, 2008. It was foreseen by the review mechanism. I'm mentioning this as an example to say I think part of what the challenge is, that the African continent needs to then to have a look at these peer reviews of countries So that, for instance, as the African Union Commission, it can then say, what is it that we need to do to assist Kenya to overcome this particular problem? An intervention of this kind to follow up on the outcomes of the review. I think this is what needs to happen, but it's been re-energized, and I think it's working very well. NEPAD is the same. It's been reformed and changed in this way and the other, but it remains the program, and its secretariat remains in this country and continues to be active in terms of addressing these African challenges. And indeed, the matters that are raised in the program Agenda 2063 are no different, really, from the matters that were raised in the NEPAD process. So, yes, indeed, in that sense, I'm saying that the African continent has remained loyal to the vision of an NEPAD. That Agenda 2063 is part of that. And the experience in terms of dealing with NEPAD suggests that the continent is committed to meet these objectives which are stated in Agenda 2063, which would include this continental free trade area. So I think that the continent will continue to pursue the objectives stated in that Agenda 2063. And I think in that context, we must take into account that the process has been that the 2063 is far away. When it was agreed, it was 50 years hence. So it was therefore necessary to do something more manageable. And therefore, what they've done at the African Union is to work on 10-year programs. So it's aiming for 2063, but you start by aiming for 2023. Then you can plan better and act better. And I think that it demonstrates a commitment to ensure that Agenda 2063 is respected. Now, on the last matter that was raised about land expropriation, I think the argument in this country is correct that the land question since '94, we have not dealt with successfully with the challenge of the land question. I think that's correct. And I therefore think it is correct that the South Africans must have an opportunity indeed to grapple with the issue, with the land question. What do we do? So historically, the point that is made that historically the indigenous population were dispossessed of the land by force and so on is historically correct. Now, so a question then arises, what do you do? I think that people in the room will be familiar with the decision taken by the last conference of the governing party, the ANC, which says land expropriation without compensation, provided that does not have a negative impact on other sectors of the economy, provided it doesn't have a negative impact on agricultural production, provided it doesn't have a negative impact on food security. Now, sure, I think everybody would want to agree that you don't want to make a negative impact on the economy. Already we've got many challenges here, challenges of unemployment and inequality and so on. You wouldn't want to worsen those. So we had agreed no negative impact on the economy? Yes, indeed. Agricultural production must not drop. Agreed, of course, agreed. Food security, same. Now, then what do you do to expropriate without compensation, without producing these negative results? I think it's a very challenging question. Unfortunately, I think it was correct when the Parliament, when they discussed this question, it took a decision that a Constitutional Review Committee of Parliament should engage the people of South Africa on this matter. Let's sit and talk to one another and say, what do we do? And I think it requires that kind, and it requires detailed concentration, attention. One day, I think it was last year or year before, I read an article. It's about a farm in the Western Cape, which had lain fallow. And then some white farmer owned this farm. And then some African people, black people, approach him and say to him, we see that this farm is lying fallow. Can we lease it from you to grow something? And the farmer says, no, you can't. The reason it's lying fallow is because the soil is exhausted. So we have got to do whatever it is necessary to do in order to make sure that we put in chemicals and so on. He says the soil is exhausted, that's why the farm is lying fallow. So I think that it would be dishonest of me to lease you a farm that is in that condition. But they insist. So in the end, the white farmer says, okay, take the farm. I'm not going to charge you anything because you're going to have trouble with this thing which the soil is there. Now, accompanying this article is a photograph of very green fields. This farm has produced lots of, it's very healthy. So I was looking at this thing, I was saying, this is a very interesting story. And I was very pleased that the South Africans would do a thing like that. Black South Africans would go and actually use this land that was lying fallow. I'll explain just now why. Until I discovered that it wasn't South Africans. It was black Zimbabweans. Teachers in the Western Cape, and in their spare time, they did the farming. And to address the issue of fertilizer and so on, they used manure instead of chemical fertilizer. They collected manure and the farm is thriving. Zimbabweans. I mention that because I think in part of the discussion about what we do about this land issue, one of the things I think we'd have to take into account is that because of a long history of land dispossession in this country, since whenever the colonialists started arriving in 1652, many of our people have become detached from the land. Now, I haven't done any research about this thing, I'm guessing that if you went to talk to a lot of the Africans here in Pretoria, who live in Pretoria, in the Pretoria townships, and you said, go and farm somewhere, you might find a bit of resistance. Population has become urbanized and knows how to work, and to say to them, become rural and run a farm, I think that might be a challenge. So one needs to understand all of these things in order to be able to answer the question, what in reality is the practical demand for land? There are many other issues of this kind. For instance, the issue of farm workers. With in certain instances here, you've had an old system of labor tenancy, of people living on the farms and supplying labor. And particular legislation was passed earlier to guarantee the rights of those sorts of people. I'm saying when you talk about the land redistribution thing, these are some of the details that we have to be discussing, which I hope will be discussed. The last thing I must say about this, talking in terms of the governing party, that's the ANC. You would hear the ANC talking quite correctly about its attachment to the vision contained in the document, the Freedom Charter. And the Freedom Charter on this issue says, the land shall be shared among those who work it. It says that the land must be shared among those who work it. Now, the registrar here does not work the land. Why must we give him a farm? Neither do I. I'm saying if we stick to what the Freedom Charter says, the challenge is of a different kind. The land shall be shared among those who work it. But part of the argument that's used now is that people were dispossessed of land from 1652, and you must therefore return the land to those who were dispossessed. It's a different argument. Hopefully, again, I'm saying hopefully, the process is agreed in Parliament of constituting this Constitutional Review Committee to consult will result in a serious debate about how to handle this matter. It isn't sufficient. It isn't sufficient, I think, to appeal to our emotions and say, my great-grandfather lost land, therefore give me land. It's, one understands the sentiment, but in the end, I think there are very many practical details relating to this matter that would have to be dealt with as this conversation takes place. First, I think I've answered those questions.
Thanks, Patron. Okay, we're going to come to this side, my left, not a political left. By the way, Patron, I don't know if you remember that Yash Tandon wrote to you, it must be about 4 years ago, after the Ongo's meeting you had, where he was proposing to you this common currency and calling it NILO. So you must look up that. I think you could find it online, actually, that some people have been making these proposals about the common currency. Yash Tandon, one of these leading scholars, calls it NILO. And we've got Dr. Rukato here. I was trying to see how she feels when you were saying NEPAD and APRM is doing well. As I'm aware from the case studies that it doesn't seem so, but I think this is an issue that will be dealt with in class as well. So let's come to the side. I think I'll start right at the back there and come to the front. So let's start right at the back. I see Moros right at the back there. And then we just come all the way to the front. And please make it brief in the interest of time. And don't follow up, please. So I see some hands here that I suspect will talk about land. I'm not going to allow that if you want to make a follow-up. Yes, please, Moros.
I was saying I did field work last year in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. My research is on Sankara. And I learned during my field work that you had a couple of encounters with Sankara at the time before the assassination. And so my question is, how do you think going forward as Africans we can shield our Aboriginal leaders from being assassinated, fighting for the cause for African political development?
Thanks. Come to the front. I think we'll tilt the hands that were there earlier. Yes.
Thank you so much. President Mbeki, I wanted to check what is your view on intra-African trade? What are the key barriers and how do you build to make sure that you break down those? And secondly, what's your view of BRICS and its future? It looks like it's more political than economic now. What's the impact on South Africa and Africa? Thank you.
Okay, the question is about intra-Africa trade and the view.
Thank you. Mr. President, my name is Ngosinath Magarani. I wanted to ask you what's your opinion on the issues of monarchs in a democracy such as South Africa. And my question is inspired by the recent land question that was raised. And the Zulu monarch resisted in terms of land expropriation without land expropriation without compensation. So I want to know if can monarchs really exist in a democracy?
Okay. Yeah, come to the front here.
Thank you very much, Professor Mbeki. My question is related to the African Continental Agreement that was signed recently. The patron talked about the regional economic communities. Now, with the signing of the African Continental Integration, do these RECs fall away and we have one common African Continental Free Trade Area? What happens to that as part of the regional integration agenda? Then the last question is, there's a big, great commentary about Nigeria not being part of this signing. Do we read much into it? What does it say? Because we understand of the strategic importance of Nigeria in the Western Africa and the continental. So what do we have to read much about it, or we just have to accept that it's part of the process of negotiations? Thanks.
What do you think? The faculty says I must come this side.
My name is I want to know His Excellency's thoughts in relation to progress in relation to gender equality in South Africa.
Okay, gender equality in South Africa. So now we have 6 questions already.
Thank you. My name is Daniel Togela. I'm from rural Bloemfontein, I reside in Pretoria. I'm a civil servant of pensions. I first have to commend the good work you do. I know yourself as an architect of ethical and good leadership in Africa. The existence of this very TMALI shows that we as Africans are taking bold steps into fixing Africa the African way. And in one of your famous speeches, I'm African, you mentioned you felt good to be an African. I am indeed grateful to be an African. The recent events, the changes domestically and in South Africa have brought in some changes. I just want to ask, how do you feel? Do you feel good to be an African?
Too much of feelings today. There's a lot about feelings today, Patron. I think it's unusual. This particular group is very emotional. There's so many questions about feelings. Yeah, we've come to the end, unfortunately, because we can't be able to take too many questions. We apologize. We're never able to take all the questions, but those other questions can be deliberated in class. And I think Patron should also, we'll see if you have to worry about the Thomas Sankara question. Maybe Moros can engage you. Because that's his PhD study. I think he's trying to get you to write his PhD. Over to you, Patron.
Yeah. Well, I don't know what we can do to to protect our leaders such as Thomas Sankara from assassination. That was the question as I understood it. Except to say that I think what is very important is that for people like this, leaders like this, you need them to be properly integrated among the people. I don't think you want some leader who's hanging out there and the masses of the people are far away. Because in the end, I think the best protection of leaders like this are the people themselves. The best protectors are the people themselves. You saw, as you were saying, the changes that have taken place in Burkina Faso with the removal of the President Blaise Compaoré. The demand for a resolution of the Sankara question became a popular demand. It's a mass demand in Burkina Faso. It's not just a matter of some elite that is calling for this thing. The people themselves want proper explanations about this thing and demand that action should be taken against whoever it was responsible for his assassination. But I'm saying that I can't think of anything other than protection by the people themselves. It doesn't guarantee against assassination, but at least I think the assassins would know that the country is against. And therefore they must know that there will be consequences to whatever action they would take. Because I'm sure that you are familiar with the details of the death of Thomas Sankara. He was killed by people he was working with very closely. But as I say, perhaps the assassins were not deterred by any knowledge that there would be a mass response against the assassination of Thomas Sankara, and were able to, and therefore to carry out this thing without a kind of deterrent of that kind. But I think otherwise you can't, I think it would be otherwise difficult for anybody to guarantee that one would not be assassinated. Because again, if you again keep with the example of Thomas Sankara, it surely must be possible for somebody who doesn't like somebody to bribe even the people around you. I think if you remember the way that Laurent Kabila in the Congo, in the DRC, was killed, the father to Joseph Kabila, the current president, again, it was people immediately around. But I'm only saying that, therefore, whoever wants to do a thing of that kind must know that for people like Thomas Sankara, there will be a popular response against things like that. So it's important, as I was saying, that progressive leaders like this should not be detached from the population. There was a question about the relationship between, as I heard it, monarchs and democracy. Well, when this matter was discussed, as we were working on the Constitution, there was a recognition that sections of our people continue to believe in the traditional leadership. And they continue to respect that leadership and to follow it. And that this was a view among sections of our people. And this is despite a long history during the colonial period, when many of these traditional leaders actually didn't stand on the side of the people. But nevertheless, the matter was recognized that among us there are people who still believe in this institution, and that it was necessary to respect that fact. And therefore, there was no push for the abolition of the system of traditional leadership in the country, out of respect for the fact that you've got sections of our population that are attached to and respect this leadership. But of course, then the question arose as to we are working to establish a democratic system. What do you do? Because you can't say, no, we can't have democracy in this area because there's a traditional leader. So I'm sure that you must have looked at the rather complex system that was then agreed. In the rural areas, where you have the traditional leaders, about how the municipality, elected municipal councils would work with the traditional leaders. I'm told that the matter still is not resolved properly from the point of view of the traditional leaders who are complaining about one thing or the other. But I'm saying basically what this country has is a democratic system, even in local areas where you have traditional leaders. But that has not meant an abolition of the system of traditional leadership. So to build a coexistence between these monarchs and democracy. I think the future of the system really, I would leave it to history to sort it out. In the end, I think it's the historical evolution of South Africa which will find an answer to this question. But what we've tried to do is to construct a system that is democratic, but as I was saying, at the same time does not abolish the monarchy, does not abolish the institution of traditional leadership. The regional economic communities will continue to exist, despite this agreement on this African free trade area, because the free trade area is got to, a free trade area is what it says it is, free trade, to allow the movement of goods and people freely. So you remove tariffs so that people can then export to one another without this limitation. That's a free trade area. It's to do with trade. And the regional economic communities have got a mandate which is much broader than that. You know, we decided this region agreed on a free trade area some years ago. And it was agreed that South Africa, being the strongest economy in the region, would deal with this matter about the lowering and removal of tariffs first and fastest. So it was a differentiated system, because the strong economy here let it open the doors and so on, so that the rest of the countries in the region can export to South Africa. Free trade area. But when we looked at the matter 5 years later, it had not changed. The economic trade relations among these countries in the SADC region. In fact, nothing had happened. And the dominance of South Africa continued. And the reason for that is that many countries did not have anything to export to South Africa. So you can say free trade area, but if South Africa grows pineapples and Swaziland grows pineapples, there's no need to export pineapples from South Africa to Swaziland or the other way around. Or you had other challenges, like the South Africans, which is normal in these sort of processes. We agreed on, as I say, on the free trade area, but then an issue arose about what are called phytosanitary standards. Because there will be an insistence, there was an insistence by the South Africans that the health of the population is important. And therefore what you export in terms of food products and so on must be healthy, fit for human consumption. And then we found that countries that could export, for instance, fruit to South Africa, they didn't have the capacity to certify that this particular fruit is fit for human consumption. So of course the South Africans said, in which case we're not going to import it. So I'm citing this to say, in terms of the regional economic communities, they've got a much broader mandate. And clearly part of what needed to have happened when SADC decided to become a free trade area was that steps should have been taken to say, and therefore what is it that we do in order to encourage investment into the other countries of the region. Just to give you one example, at the time, we thought that tire manufacturing might migrate from South Africa to Mozambique and Zimbabwe, because both of those countries also were producing tires. And so there was concern even among the unions, that there were going to be job losses, because now, given that it's a free trade area, they'd produce the tires in Mozambique cheaper than South Africa, and produce them in Mozambique, transport them to South Africa, and still sell cheaper than a South African-made tire. So there was concern about this. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen because when you then talk to the tire manufacturers, they were saying that infrastructure in this country, yes, indeed, they produce tires, but the infrastructure that is needed to produce volumes of tires in the numbers that would be required, for instance, in the South African market, they didn't have that kind of infrastructure. And therefore, they wouldn't move and didn't. So I'm saying that, for instance, regional economic communities, as part of what they would have to do, these African countries which now have a free trade area for the continent, do they have anything to sell to one another? But that means then increasing the productive capacity of these African countries so that indeed they do this. This would be part of the responsibility of the regional economic communities, which would continue to exist. As I've understood this thing, and I may be wrong, the reason that Nigeria didn't sign was because issues arose in Nigeria that there had not been sufficient discussion in Nigeria with the trade unions and with business people about this free trade area. So I don't know, our colleague here from Nigeria might know better. But that's what I understood, that the business and the unions were asking for better engagement with the government of Nigeria about what does this thing mean. Because you can understand, you see, the concern. If you say to Nigeria, let's have a free trade area. Agreed, agreed. And you say, and then the Nigerians had a plan to increase capacity for motor car assembly, motor car production, and all of that. And suddenly it's free trade. You obviously have to ask yourself the question, what happens to our decision about motor car assembly? Because what this means is that the South Africans are going to be exporting cars to Nigeria, which is going to kill our effort here in Nigeria to produce cars. These questions that would arise quite legitimately. So as I say, as I understand this, the decision, the issue in Nigeria was about the population, mainly business and the unions, trade unions, saying we need more engagement with our government before you, government, then go and sign on our behalf as Nigerians. So their government agreed to that, which is why they couldn't sign at that particular point. So it's not because Nigeria is against this thing, but there's more detailed work that needs to be done domestically. The BRICS is important. Some time ago, we had a discussion with Brazil and India. And that discussion was that what's happened over time is that the non-aligned movement has become weaker. Hence, the voice of the developing countries was disappearing. It was necessary to do something about this because in terms of the way the world is evolving, you want to strengthen the voice of the developing countries rather than weaken it. But now, with the weakening of the non-aligned movement, what do we do? So these three countries agreed that, look, let's get together. That's India, Brazil, and South Africa, and form a small association. Because these three countries carry the kind of weight that if they speak together, people will listen. We then had thought that we would invite China to come and join this group. And to deal with the Middle East, we'd also thought that Saudi Arabia would be invited. And then, so this is a discussion that's going on. And we contacted China and said to them, look, this is what we're thinking. So you'd have China, India, Brazil, South Africa acting together, and that would be a powerful coalition to speak not on behalf for themselves, but on behalf of the countries of the South. Unfortunately, some of our colleagues in that coalition of three were very impatient to move. And so they moved without China. So that's why you had this IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa formation. The idea was to make sure that you have this voice to represent the views of the developing countries. Plus, you then use the economic capacity shared among these countries to impact as much as you can positively on the rest of the countries, the developing countries. For instance, the group set up a fund. It was a development fund, so that it could intervene, help in other countries of the South in terms of addressing their economic challenges. I'm telling the story because, as you can see, the BRICS is an evolution of that idea, with the addition of Russia. Otherwise, it's the original coalition: India, Brazil, South Africa, China, and now Russia. And I think it hasn't got so much of the emphasis that IBSA had in terms of being the voice of the developing world, and becomes more of a development instrument. For instance, this talk about the BRICS Bank and so on, which has been established, brings in a lot of money, billions of dollars, for development purposes. So it's not, of course, BRICS is also doing lots of things to, from those 5 countries, to bring together the intellectuals, to bring together the youth, to bring together the women, and then so on, to try and reinforce this integration and coalition and cooperation. But I think it is, it's more focused, not so much on being the voice of the developing world, but more focused on what can we do as these countries to impact as positively as possible on the development challenges, so that we're not entirely exclusively dependent on the World Bank and the IMF and the Western donor countries and so on, but this is an instrument to address these various challenges. I think some progress has been made in this country with regard to the matter of gender equality. But clearly, there's a lot more that needs to be done. When we're in government, one of the issues that we attempted, I'm not sure how successfully, was an attempt at gender mainstreaming. And I'd like to hope that people know what this phrase means, gender mainstreaming. But I think that this is something that we need to look at, because it means when you work on policy and programs, or whatever the issue, it must be roads or clinics or whatever, in that planning you raise the question, what impact does it have on women in the context of gender equality, etc.? I'm saying gender mainstreaming in that sense. I think it's necessary to do that. A small example, for instance, was given. If you look at universities and registrar, I suspect even our university here, you would find in terms of the teaching staff, the women would more or less be bunched up as lecturers, junior lecturers. It's general, it's in the university system. Part of the reason is that women give birth to children. The men don't. Now, so there's a certain period when the pregnant mother must go and attend to this matter of giving birth and so on. And because you don't do gender mainstreaming, all you'll say, she is not here to teach. Of course she's not here to teach. And that impacts negatively on whatever it is that should happen in terms of promotion, etc. A small example of this, one university in the United States dealing with this question, for instance, they said some of their lecturers, teachers, women, have got to, at some point during the day, break away to go and breastfeed the children at home. Now, that's a kind of minus, time-wise, from the point of view of the university, because you are absent there. So the university, this is one university in the United States, said, in which case, one of the things, way to address this thing, is why don't we have a room at the university so that these mothers who are breastfeeding can breastfeed their children here instead of having to drive home and drive back. And therefore you have to do everything else to make sure that these children are also here and so on. This is a small example of what I mean by this gender mainstreaming. And I think it's going to be necessary in the South African case that we do that, to be able to say specifically with regard to the things that we're saying about the National Development Plan. If the National Development Plan says this is what must happen with regard to road infrastructure, ask the question, the program that you have for road infrastructure, does it include this element of gender equality? Mainstreaming, I'm saying, in that sense. So I think that's necessary, but I think it is important that the country is very conscious of this, of the need to continue to struggle for this gender equality, fight against violence against women and all that. It's important that this remains part of the agenda, even if sometimes it sounds rhetorical, but that it remains on the agenda is important. Because it's a matter that, in a sense, helps to define even whether we're a democracy or not. So the last question. Okay, first, what do I say? You know, I think there are many good things, positive things that are happening on our continent. I'm very fortunate that I have the possibility to move around the continent, visit various countries. On one occasion, we were in Abuja, in Nigeria, And I was asked to go and buy some paintings in a small market in Abuja, so I went there. It was not a small market, but it's a marketplace with a number of kiosks, stalls. So I walked around and got these pictures, paintings. And then as we were leaving, it's a kind of, sort of like a circle with these shops. So as we're leaving, we see at the entrance to this area, large group of people, Nigerians, and President, pictures. So they'd recognize me. So they just waited until we finished, and then we had to stand there for an hour taking pictures, smiling. He said, what that told me is that the African people, the ordinary people, have heard what we've been saying. And they agree. And they agree. I think that should make us happy as Africans. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Patron. We've come to the end of this interactive session. Tshepo, please come and announce. I think there's something you need to announce. And thanks a lot to the registrar for welcoming Patron and Chancellor of the University, and to the colleagues, and for braving the weather. For those that are not our students, I see a few people who came, so it's good that you could come. Okay, there's going to be a group photo, as usual.